What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 106, and I'm the co-host Kyle Anslone, joined by the other co-host Will Porter. Will, how you doing today?
Doing great, Kyle. Excited for this episode we got coming up here.
Yeah, so me and Will just talked to Danny Sjursen. We got the interview coming up right after this, and it's a good one. I'm really excited. Everybody's going to enjoy it. We break down what's going on in Chad and West Africa and the French American Empire operating there. Danny knows just so much about all the countries in this area. Most places people can't find on a map, and he's there to break it down. This is probably the of all the foreign policy focus shows, the ones I recommend most checking out the video version of, because we do go through and talk about so many countries that, hell, I'm sure a lot of people you ask, say Burkina Faso, they say, what's that? They don't know it's a country. So definitely check out the video versions. We publish it at YouTube and at Odyssey. And then, of course, the video version is embedded at the Libertarian Institute where the show is hosted. You can also check out the social media accounts for the page. We got Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter. The Twitter account is at @con_interest. And you can also support the show by supporting our sponsor, Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeStore.com is a brand new website. So unless you've gone to the site in the past week, you need to go and just check it out and see all the great new stuff they have up there. It's a much more like interactive website. It's a website that was built in 2021. So you're absolutely going to love it. And then once you go there and you check it out, you're really going to like their products too. I really like their topicals, their sports cream and their slobs. And they also have like a lotion stick that's great. Will, I know you're a fan of like some of their stuff infused with melatonin, and I was looking. They actually have some new products coming out that use a different cannabinoid. It's still not going to be THC, so it's not going to get you like high, but it's another cannabinoid to help you to feel better, sleep better. So tons of great products over there at PalomaVerdeStore.com, and now a great new website to go with it. Be sure to use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, and of course that's super easy to remember with the topics we talk about on this show, and you'll get yourself a 25% discount at checkout when you spend $75 or more. And Will, let's get into the show.
All right, let's do it.
Hey Danny, welcome back to Conflicts of Interest.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for talking about this.
Yeah, well, excited to have you back on. Although a little nervous too, because the first time I had you on the show, we talked about Africa, and you mentioned at the end that, hey, we might be deploying troops to Mozambique, and now we have troops in Mozambique. The last time I had you on the show, we talked about Chad and about how important that country was to kind of the Franco-American empire that runs in the Sahel region in West Africa. And I mentioned to you, like, hey, seems like him sending his troops all over when there's rebels in his country doesn't sound like a good idea. And now the longtime dictator of Chad is dead. And so this is an interesting geopolitical situation, and I don't think there's anybody better to talk about than you. I'm not sure if there is anybody who really did like a whole podcast or a deep dive on Chad other than what we did earlier in this year. And so I think that's a very relevant show. I'll link to it in the show notes page. I hope people go back and check that out because it really does. I'm sure we can't get into all that again today, but Danny, maybe just start off with what the hell happened? How it doesn't seem like the capital city at Chad was sacked or anything, or that bodies were piling up. It's very interesting when we saw like Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi eventually get captured and killed. They lasted for a while. Their capital cities were, what I mean, and this guy seemed to have been one of the first casualties of the fighting.
And that's interesting. And I want to talk about kind of who he is, like who Deby is. I mean, that's an important point, and how that's been framed. But you mentioned how I've made some predictions that have. I mean, it's been a little fortuitous, and makes it sound like I know more than I do. But I'll say this about the predictions game: if you follow this stuff in any depth, you don't have to be a soothsayer. Like some of these patterns have been going on so long, and the only problem is that it's not talked about a lot in the media. So you got to deep dive, but but if you have a vague sense of what's going on, not vague, it's got to be pretty deep. Then it's not that hard to predict. Now, some of it, like Deby dying, who knew that was going to happen? But I will say that the experts on this, and there aren't a lot, have been saying for years. Like, if you Google this, you can find articles that will basically say what's going to happen if Deby dies. And so how does he die? Well, there's a lot of conspiracy theorizing about that, which we'll get to, I think. But, the story is, and it may well be true, given his past, that he flies up to the front lines, which is about, I think it was about 200 miles-ish north of the capital, to face off the newest rebel convoy that was heading towards his capital to try to depose him. The reason I say the newest is that this has happened many times. Okay, many times. He's constantly fighting off rebellions. He took power in his own rebel convoy, his left from the Darfur region of Sudan, which is actually the most typical place for a rebel invasion, but second only to Libya, where there's been a ton. Anyway, the thing is, he does this. He would often say that he was basically a general and a soldier first. One of the interesting things about that is Western quote unquote liberal leaders and their, kind of proxies and spokespeople have been lauding him for that. They've been saying, well, he died as he lived, a warrior in the fight against terror. He said he would, rather die at the battlefield or whatever than in his bed, and he kept his promise. Those are quotes from our ambassador to the UN, right? Who is supposed to be this like liberal human rights valuing human being. And what's been interesting about that, and then I'll kind of like let you pivot to all the other things to talk about, but this is crazy talk. The idea that we are lauding the martial qualities, right? We're fetishizing the militarism of people who took power in a military coup, stayed in power for 30 years, murdered opposition figures, recruited child soldiers. All this is ludicrous. I mean, it's such an absurdity that I actually do think that like Joseph Heller would have trouble writing a Catch-22 type novel about it. And yet it's not really dug into. It's not really pointed out that hypocrisy, but it really bothers me. I'll be honest. I mean, one of the quotes that I have from the ambassador, Thomas Greenleaf, right? She says, many Chadians have only known him as president. But like, there was no and that's terrible because people shouldn't be president for 30 years because we're the beacon of democracy and light in the world. No, she just left it there. And I was like, wait, there's no caveat? No, nothing. And then she lauded him as like a friend and a warrior. And I was just like, I don't know. I just think Chad is one of these places where how people respond to it, it's like, you're showing me your character right now, like as a politician. Like if you're willing to stand in front of a microphone and be like, what a great warrior. I'm like, okay, so nothing else that you say is honest, or I can't know that it is.
Right. So on the last show, Dan, we talked about how Chad was central in deploying forces to other countries in the Sahel region. And for people who aren't watching the show, I have a map up here so you could kind of see a bunch of countries that nobody ever talks about on the map and where they are and where the Chadian forces may have been deployed. But that this was like kind of central for France maintaining a lot of their dominance over countries in this region. And, these are massive countries with important resources to France. And in 2019, when there was a coup attempt against Deby, and I think that one came north from Libya, France intervened with airstrikes. And so I would assume that we would have French intervention again. Is there any indication of why the US or France didn't intervene, or if this guy was really maybe that just type that was, there's 100 rebels out there, he doesn't need the French, he's gonna go take care of them and kick their ass himself, and he ends up catching it? Like, just that happens. It seems unbelievable, but I suppose it is, Arkham's razor type of thing, most likely, probably.
Yeah, you're pointing out a couple of interesting things here. I mean, okay, so there were about 400 to 450 rebel vehicles in this convoy. We'll talk about where they came from in a second. But the thing that is almost likable almost is the key word about someone like Deby, is that if you're a nostalgist for the time when kings led their armies in battle, he's that guy. I mean, the one thing you could say about it was, I guess he had some courage. But here's the reason, partly. Deby was a one-man show. And that's why the experts who really follow this were saying, what happens when the guy dies? We've seen this show before, right? He holds that place together with basically the bubble gum and scotch tape of corruption and nepotism and like ethnic ties, personal leadership. So his biggest fear is his own army turns on him. I mean, this FACT, F-A-C-T, it's a French acronym. I don't even remember what it stands for. Front for Concord and Change in Chad, I think.
Yeah, that's correct.
They're made up. They were formed in like 2016 by former army officers. So, you know, this is a country with 150 ethnic groups. They can't all even talk to each other. It's very clannish, even below that. He holds this together with personal leadership. So flying up to the front is more than just like courage and nostalgia for the kings. You know, it's a way that he makes sure that his army doesn't turn, or that they don't break and then join the rebels or just flee and go home. So he's got to rally the troops. Now, but the reason the conspiracy theories, which I don't even know if they should be called conspiracy theories, I think they're just theories, I mean, that we should talk. Why did France not bomb this convoy? And isn't it coincidental that he dies going to the front against the convoy that France didn't bomb? Furthermore, isn't it wildly interesting that those trucks that they were driving in, some of the training they got, and likely many of the arms that the FACT rebels, you know, were carrying, were potentially likely provided by Khalifa Haftar, the, you know, wannabe warlord strongman who's contesting, you know, control of Libya and controls like the east of Libya, because the French have supported him rather overtly and in violation of arms embargoes, you know, since 2014-ish.
And so they actually let him travel to France for medical treatment when after his forces were accused of summary executions and there's pretty good evidence of it. I couldn't believe that he was able to go to France for medical care and come back.
Yeah, unbelievable. I mean, the French don't play, man. I'll say that. They are, you know, we always think of them as like these super like liberal softies, like that narrative from the Bush years when they, you know, did that horrible thing, not come to Iraq with us and do that illegal war. Make no mistake, the French are the most neo-imperial of all. They're the kings of it, you know, and they just do it. They're not even embarrassed. But there is a little bit of politicking to this. So there's a lot of so one theory is the French were in on killing him. You know, they actually like worked with his subordinate officers, maybe even his son, and that he was shot by his own people. I don't think that's probably true, but who knows? Unlikely. Second one is sometimes that you can do a coup by doing nothing. In other words, if Deby is in power because of you and you just doing nothing sometimes is going to have a result. So maybe the rebels come in, he just happens to get killed in an early battle. That's possible, but I think the thing is that the FACT rebels kind of got beat anyway, it looks like. I mean, it's not over, but they got pushed back. It doesn't look like they really necessarily had the horsepower, no pun intended, to like get to the capital. I think more likely is that France got so caught up in its twisted game of proxy warfare and dictator backing and like puppeteering that all the strings, right, on all the puppets got mixed up and it blows back on them. This happens all the time to us. It happens a whole lot to France. When you're dealing with various dictators across a region that's several, if not dozens of times larger than France, you're going to run into this. But Macron has an election next year, and he's got a problem. He's got to shore up his right and look tough on Africa, but he's got to shore up his like left and center, and unilaterally bombing rebel convoys and then saying, oh, it's part of the war on terror, which is what he said. I mean, he rolled it up under the Operation Barkhane anti-terror mission, but they weren't Islamists, you know. That didn't play so well in France with another group. So he's doing what Democrats do here, or old school establishment Republicans. He's walking a tightrope, and his eyes on that election. Of course, we'll talk about it later probably. He's facing like a potential old school military revolt a little bit.
Yeah.
How powerful that is, we can discuss. But basically, he's got to shore up his right, and the French military is pretty right wing, and or at least a lot of them are, and that's another issue he's got to deal with. I think what happened here, I don't know for sure, but if I was a betting man, if the evidence really ever came out, France just fumbled this. Incompetence is one of the better explanations, Occam's razor style, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, when it comes to the future of Chad, I've been reading that apparently Deby's son, Mohammed Kaka, I think his name is, apparently he's supposed to be taking over, taking up some position of authority there. And I'm just wondering what your impression is of him. If you had any, is he sort of like, is he like a self-proclaimed kind of reformer type, like a Saif Gaddafi, or is he more someone who, like, this guy should not be given power at all, like a, Uday Nkuse or something? He's a bastard, and this is going to be a disaster.
We don't know for sure, but the reporting that I have on him, Kaka's his nickname, which I think means grandmother, because he was like maybe partly raised by his grandmother. Anyway, he's a 37-year-old 4-star general. That's Chad for you, That's always happened. Like, well, it's like my son complains that like the coach's son gets too much playing time. I'm like, dude, go to Chad. You know what I mean? That kid would be like Marshall. But supposedly he's actually fairly respected by the soldiers he used to command. I guess he distinguished himself in fighting the Sudanese border at one point, and he also commanded, or was the assistant commander, I believe, of the soldiers from Chad fighting Boko Haram. They call him I guess some of his supporters call him the man in the black glasses, or the man in the dark glasses. He's always wearing like sunglasses, and all I could think of was like Cool Hand Luke, like the evil guard or whatever. But it doesn't sound like he's an Uday or Nkuse. That doesn't mean he's a liberal Democrat. Right. He commanded the Presidential Guard. They have but the Presidential Guard's not just like, the red dudes who guard Emperor Palpatine. They're like a shock force. I mean, they're a military force.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, France just gave him a bunch of armored vehicles like this year, and outfits, the whole thing, and America has too. That same unit. But the Constitution of Chad, they do have one. They don't follow it, obviously, and Deby just changes it whenever it suits him so he can keep getting elected. But it says very clearly that basically the Speaker of the National Assembly, or the Parliament, or whatever they call it, takes charge, and that within 60 or 90 days there has to be new elections for a civilian government. But that's not what happened. What happened is a military council just appointed itself in charge because of the crisis of his sudden death, and they say that there's an emergency situation because they're at war like everywhere. And at some point, I think we should pull up a map and I'll just go clockwise and say where Chad has troops deployed or whatever. But basically what they said is it's a crisis, so we're taking charge. We're appointing his son, how convenient, to be the head of the military council. And we're going to basically rule kind of by fiat until 18 months from now, when we promise we'll have elections. Now, the opposition in Chad, such as it is, it's been so beat down by Deby over the years, is saying that's a coup. Like, that's a different kind of military coup. And it is.
Yeah.
And we can talk about this, but France initially was like all in. There was a lot of international blowback, domestic blowback in Chad. And then, the new government led by Deby's son shot some protesters in the street, 5 or 6 of them dead, and shot more, killed 6 or whatever. And then France backpedaled and said, no, we want to see a transition to civilian government sooner. But a lot of that's dissembling and cosmetic, because what they're calling for is like a hybrid sort of thing, where like, there'll be like a power sharing agreement between civilians and military. And I have a feeling that's going to be a lot of show. But what happened here is a coup. The question is, will it hold?
Yeah, it seems very obvious to me, Danny, that if this happened in Venezuela or, let's say, Syria, and Bashar al-Assad took a bullet, I don't know if he has a son that's of age, but assuming he had a 37-year-old son who was a 4-star general, if he then claimed that he was the ruler of Syria, it would be a coup all day long. All day you would just hear over and over how this terrible coup unfolded in Syria. And so that they're not saying it here, it makes me think that, you know, they must have pretty good faith that this kid is going to more or less fall in line. Will, I had the exact same question as you listed as, you know, does he seem more of a reformer or not? But I guess from the U.S. and French perspective, is there any indication that they're looking at changing the way they're operating in the region because of this change, or does it seem like they're going to try to go ahead as business as usual?
That was my next question.
I think they're going to go business as usual, but I'm not sure that's going to hold. I mean, one way to look at this is we put the France especially, but the United States too, put all their eggs in the Deby basket, and people die, right? And this is a country that has had more years of its existence than not. It's been in civil war. It's had dozens of coup attempts. It's had, I'm not sure, 10 like genuine rebellions, you know, attempts to take the capital. You know, it's happened 3 times in Deby's tenure. This was the 4th, actually. And so this was a bad plan. You know, they put all their eggs in his basket and never had really a contingency plan for what if. Think about it this way, just from a physical real estate perspective, by going all in for Deby, they went so all in that the headquarters for Operation Barkhane, which is France's largest military deployment since the war in Algeria in 1962, which was a national like tragedy. I mean, it was a huge deal. They had almost had a military coup over it. Yeah. It's headquartered in the capital of Chad. So is the multinational joint task force, the MNJTF, which is the 4 countries around Lake Chad who are fighting Boko Haram, which is considered like the bloodiest insurgency in Africa. And I think it is by the numbers. They're all both headquartered there. And so this is an issue because even just from a real estate perspective, if an unfriendly government came to power in Chad that said, you know what, we're not doing neo-imperialism anymore. We're not going to be Western lackeys anymore. If that ever happened, then what? You know, Barkhane, I guess they could find another city to do it in, but it's not just that. I'm just describing like the physical characteristics. They have relied on Chad to be a literally subcontractor of their underpaid, underfed soldiers to serve as cannon fodder for especially French, but also U.S. AFRICOM bidding to do our bidding. And that made sense because France doesn't have a big enough army. It actually stretches them to keep 5,200 soldiers, 5,500 soldiers in Africa, like on an operation like Barkhane since 2014, well, really 2013 when it was called Operation Serval. That's a pretty big stretch on them, on their resources. And America just doesn't have the political will right now. It's not going to play probably to put, 10,000 soldiers in Africa. So a really great solution was like the proxy subcontracted solution of Chad. And we didn't even care that he was recruiting child soldiers. Like I said the last time we did this, Obama just waived that requirement that we don't ally with countries that commit war crimes, including child soldiers, That's no surprise. That's how business operates when we do proxy wars. And it's always been thus. Reagan backed the predecessor of Deby, Habre, I believe, who was a sexual slaver. He's convicted of that in the International Criminal Court, and everyone knew. Everyone knew. It was like families that just like they act okay in public, but everyone knows that like, well, Uncle so and so touches kids. Like everyone has like their skeletons in their closet. It wasn't a secret, So it's business as usual, except what happens if Chad really falls apart? Because the instinct, like I said, when I was doing my I didn't even know I was doing predictions really, but the instinct is going to be pull the troops from the fighting front, the Chadian troops back home to protect the regime. And a lot of these interventions really do rely in terms of manpower on Chadian troops. I think that there was no contingency plan. I think that the West is going to try to follow the same playbook because they don't have another. And we'll see what happens. That playbook was flawed from the start. It's not working. So frankly, I don't even really care. I mean, I do in the sense of it hurts human beings, but they'll try to keep playing a failing script, and that failing script may not work anymore. And I guess they'll have to come up with something else. I don't know. Maybe it'll be worse. Maybe it won't. But I think a lot of people are spinning their wheels right now and are worried.
Yeah. So one thing I'm always surprised about is how bad they are at this. I think everybody thinks that like they Dick Cheney was good at waging war. No, he wasn't. Like they got duped into taking out Saddam Hussein for the Shia. It worked out well for the Iranians, not the Iraqis, not the Americans, and so it's one of those things. Well, what else you got?
Yeah, I guess you mentioned Deby's predecessor. What was his name? Hassan Habri.
Mm-hmm.
And you know how I believe both the U.S. and France supported him at one point. Do you know anything about just how Deby like rose to power? Because it seems at some point we stopped backing that guy and we started backing Deby. Do you know what like went into that? Just that decision, I guess.
This is an important backstory actually, because remember that the FACT rebels, came from Libya, and that happens. Remember also that France was the real energy behind taking Gaddafi out in 2011. I'm not taking the onus off us and Obama, but like they were really motivated. And that was weird to people. People heard that and they thought it was weird. And the Republicans were like, oh, Obama's leading from behind. What a wuss. And I'm like, you don't get it. You don't even know you don't know France at all. France will bomb the hell out of Africa. They're into that. It's like their thing. But what they didn't understand is that there's a backstory. France loathes Libya. They loathed Gaddafi. They lost dozens and dozens of soldiers in combat against either Libyan overt troops in several wars that lasted about a decade, and then even more against Libyan-backed rebels. So the bottom line in Chad is that the people from the very far north along the Libyan border, they have kind of like cross-border connections. Gaddafi was, they're called like Tubus, I believe, or I'm missing a letter there, but they have, some of them support Libya and would kind of like to be Libyan-ish, and some of them like support Chad. But, most of the people of Chad live in the south. It's the fertile area, right? You can see it's below the Sahel. So that's a rainfall thing. That's agriculture's down there. That's why there's more rivers, and you look up north, there's no rivers, right? Like I just want to use a map to teach like history. I used to joke about that. You just like, give me a map and I'll teach you history of a place. But what was going on is that Gaddafi had he had two things he was really about, besides like his Amazon female bodyguards. Two things that he was really about was anti-colonialism, or at least he said he was, he was against neo-imperialism wherever he saw it. That's why he gave guns to the IRA and also to African rebels, right? Anybody he saw as like opposing European and American imperialism and neo-imperialism, he was going to support them. And he also had this idea of like a pan-African vision, like especially in the north. That's why he supported the Tuaregs, who are, important in like northern Mali. They're like a nomadic-ish, semi-nomadic people. So he invades that Uzu Strip or Oazu Strip, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, that I think is actually listed up there on that straight line that obviously a European with like a cigar and some brandy drew. He invades that area and says he's basically liberating, those folks who live in the north, and also supports rebels that use Libya, and he arms them and stuff as like a kind of a safe haven to arm and equip and then drive to the capital and try to take over. What they said was they're overturning the Southern-backed government that ignores them in terms of like social services and political power. They're not wrong about that, by the way. The Sahara people, who kind of dominate the South and are the largest of the ethnic groups, did control the government. France is not having that, okay? Because Chad is their territory. In fact, there's been more French military interventions in Chad than any other African country, and France has intervened more in Africa since the end of colonialism than anybody else, north of 50 times in approximately 20 countries. That's a lot of intervening, right? No one knows this, right? We assume the French are like some sort of softies, they just started the Nazis. No, they're more than that. But point is, France goes there in like 78, 81, 82, and then 84. And especially in 82 and 84, they're duking it out with Libyans in northern Chad, like ground battles, And Reagan supports with the CIA operation, a massive one, including like, advisors on the ground and guns and tons of money. and a whole bunch of CIA provided Toyota Hilux pickup trucks, like the Taliban likes. In 1987, the climax of all this is called the Toyota War. I mentioned it the last time. The Toyota War, because it's waged in the desert. Like, people drive around in Toyotas like Mad Max style. So anyway, Habre is the guy that they kind of choose to. They let him be the dictator. They back him because he's like Deby. He says, I'll do whatever the West says as long as you keep me in power. And I'll do anything. You can put troops here. You keep giving me money, and protect my regime. Two reasons Deby rises to power, really. Deby was another guy who was like a 37-year-old four-star general. I mean, when he was his son's age, he was the chief of staff of the army under Habre. They were buddies, and they hated Libya, right? That was their mortal enemy. Twist, he has a falling out with Habre over reasons I don't really remember, but I've read, and he runs away. And he runs away to Sudan. He can't really go to Libya because he's just been running the army that's fighting Gaddafi. He might lose his head. Goes to Sudan, raises like another rebel group in the late 80s. Twist, after the French and the Americans, but not really, and the government in Chad basically make a truce, like a ceasefire status quo with Gaddafi in like 88. Well, the crimes of the Habre regime are kind of embarrassing at that point. He's not useful to us anymore because Libya is not really a threat. They are not invading any longer. The Cold War is winding down. You know how that goes, right? That happened to a lot of dictators who we supported. Once the Cold War wound down, they were like, well, we don't really need these guys anymore. We'll let them get overthrown. So we shift a little bit of support to Deby, but guess who else supports Deby when he tries to take over the regime and overthrow Habre? Gaddafi. I mean, this is a neighborhood, right? And so it's fascinating that he comes to power partly with Libyan help, who are supposed to be our mortal enemies. Reagan has like a hard on for these guys. I mean, he's obsessed with Gaddafi. Like every American president seems to like just get like laser focused on whoever their new Hitler is. That was his or one of his. So that's how he gets to power. So if we don't think he was complicit in those crimes, Habre's been called, if you don't count like Rwanda, which I don't think was quite the same thing in terms of the central direction. By the way, the French enabled that too, according to a recent UN report, that genocide. Talk about that some other time if you want. But Habre maybe murdered 40,000, ordered the killing of like 40,000 of his own people. In addition to the sexual slavery, which, that's always fun. They've called him like the most murderous African strongman of the modern era. And this guy was bad. So the chief of staff of his army at the height of his reign, Deby, I mean, even though he's done plenty of crimes since then, although they, in comparison to Habre's, he was on it. I mean, he was the chief of staff of the army. You think the army wasn't being used to do those executions? I mean, the whole thing is a nightmare. It's a nightmare. That backstory is important though, because Libya is the gift that keeps on giving. And because of that backstory, that's one of the reasons France was like, yeah, let's get rid of this guy. And I bet, we don't have enough bombs to do it. Like they literally had to be resupplied. They ran out of bombs. But they were like, we can't do it ourselves because we're not that anymore. We think we're this, but we can't cash the checks we write. So we'll get America. And that's what they did. And Obama fell right for it.
Right. It's crazy that, I mean, I grew up, after 9/11. So I remember like 2003, they weren't even French fries anymore. They are freedom fries because, the French, like what people say, they're like, the French are pussies. They're unwilling to fight. And that's definitely not the case. Danny, you said you wanted to talk some about some of the places the Chadian troops were deployed in the region. I'll pull up a map here, and let's just start breaking it down. And because all these conflicts are ongoing, I mean, if you read Reuters or the AP international news, 2 or 3 times a week you'll read either Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Algeria. One of these countries has 10, 20, 30, and they'll always say killed by Islamists, but it's pretty serious fighting going on there. Whatever the actual dynamics are of a lot of people are winding up dead, and it seems like a lot of like very innocent people, like the gruesome kind of killing people on motorbikes, come to a village, they burn all the houses down, and the women and children die in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you had another map that had all the countries on it? Because this one will do, but there's a map south of, I don't know if you could zoom in, because one of the countries isn't listed on that I need to talk about, Central African Republic. But if you can't zoom in, I can use that one just fine.
Yeah, I can't zoom in. This is as
No,
close as
fine.
it
Go back
gets.
to the other one then. So I said in the article I just wrote that, Chad is the spoke in like a 360-degree wheel of like conflicts, regional conflicts. So we talked about Libya to the north. So, we fractured Libya. Now it's in a state of civil war, although there's like a tenuous truce right now. See if it holds. That's a big problem, because there's mercenaries there from all over Africa and from Europe, including Russians. And that's the only ones we ever talk about for some reason, because, Russia bad. That's a big destabilizing factor. There are way more Chadian mercenaries up there than there ever are Wagner Group guys. And like the fact rebels didn't just get armed and equipped by Haftar. He doesn't give anything away for free, right? He used them as mercenaries for years. They fought for him. So that's how they learned to fight. Now, if you go southeast of there, Sudan, this is a really bad time right now. This is like a perfect storm for the region. It's the bloodiest time. I mean, the whole Sahel is a nightmare right now. Literally every country, Darfur's back in the news a little. The massacres are starting again. Retaliatory killings. The Janjaweed are riding their horses and burning villages down again. The rebels are attacking the government. And oh, by the way, there's kind of an unstable post-Second Arab Spring situation there where the more, I guess, reformist civilian government that took over for Bashir, the longtime sort of dictator, is, having to make deals with the military men who used to work for Bashir, some of whom are complicit in war crimes in Darfur. So there's a lot of massacres happening there. That's right over the border from Chad. Again, that's where Deby started his rebellion in 1990. And that spills over. People forget this too. From 2004 to 2010, really 08 was when the fighting ended, but 10 was when they made the accord that stopped it. Bashir in the Sudan, right, the leader of Sudan, who's from the north of Sudan, who doesn't like the people from South Sudan and doesn't like the people in Darfur, who aren't Muslim and all that, or different, they're black or whatever it is. I'm simplifying. He and Deby didn't get along. They waged a proxy war where they both funded the rebels in each other's countries, and in both countries, the rebels got to the capital and were fighting in the capital. They didn't overthrow each other, but they came really close. In Sudan, it happened twice, in 2006 and 2008. This was a very big proxy war. A lot of people died. Never made the news. If anything, it was a sub-footnote of the war in Darfur. Oh, by the way, Deby's group, the Zaghawa, right, which is like a clan of an ethnic group up there, there's a lot of them who live in Darfur. And oh, by the way, a lot of them support the rebels there who were fighting against the Sudanese government. There's cross, ethnic connections, as there often are in Africa, right? Because the way the lines are drawn. So refugee flows are coming into Chad. Your life is really bad if you think your best option is, I guess I'll go to Chad and live there. I mean, I'm joking, but not really, right? This is a real thing. So that's a problem. Will that peace that they made, where they agreed to stop supporting proxies in each other's countries, will that hold? We don't know. We don't know for sure, especially if this guy looks weak, the son, or if his position looks weak. Okay, so cutting directly south of Chad, that country that's directly south, but that's the Central African Republic. That's the basket case of Africa, which is saying something. Colony, former colony. France has intervened there a billion times, right? I think bazillion is the correct terminology for it. They usually do it with Chad. They pick winners of elections. The fighting in the Central African Republic is hot again. There were elections at the end of last year or the beginning of this year that were contested. The three opposition parties. Look, political parties in this part of Africa often have their own rebel group or their own militia, and most of them used to be rebels. It's kind of your street cred you need to be a politician. It's a little different than here, where we only have armchair killers. Right? They don't have to even be in the military. So Chad has brought troops there before as part of a UN mission, as part of a French intervention before that. Chad does not have soldiers there now, I don't believe, because they were accused very credibly of massive human rights violations, extrajudicial killing, and picking sides, right? Which France was doing too, but when Chad does it, they just do it like old school. You know, like they literally pick sides and kill the others. So they had to leave. You know, they've been kind of expelled. But there's a history there. And oh, by the way, I think even just 2 weeks ago, maybe like 11,000 new Central African Republican, I don't even know what you call it, someone who lives in a country with that kind of name, refugees from the fighting there went into southern Chad. So that's an issue, right? Cameroon, we don't really need to talk about, except to say that's the one directly to the west of that. That's not labeled, except to say that Cameroon in the north, that's called like the the Quad Lake region, where Chad, Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon meet, and that's Boko Haram territory, right? Which their base is in the northeast of Nigeria, but they've spilled over. Lake Chad is between those four countries. They share its water, although it's shrunk by about 80% over the last decades, which is a problem. Cameroon is involved in that fight, the multinational joint task force I was talking about. But, you know, the only thing about Cameroon, it's not as big of a basket case as the others. The thing to know about it is that Chad's landlocked, of course, but its oil goes through there. Its oil goes through Cameroon. That's how the pipeline gets out. So that's important. Nigeria, we know what that is. That's a country that is, you know, not battling for its life, but battling for control of its north with a very potent Boko Haram movement, which is formed. There's always this north-south divide in African countries in this region. And the north is always a little more Sahelian, deserty, and sparse, and gets ignored. It doesn't get as many resources, and is treated like an internal colony, usually by the governments, which are almost always capitaled in the south. I mean, interesting thought experiment. With the exception of Sudan, the capital of every one of these countries is in the south. I mean, part of that's because if they have a coastline, they want it to be there, but it's a fascinating thing. That's where most of the people live. So that's Nigeria. Chad has lots of troops in that JTF. It usually, I think there's 4 countries that give troops to it, but I think usually they have 30 to 40% is from them. They're also considered the most effective fighters. Well, they do a lot of it, right? They're seasoned. Nigeria's president is freaked out. He's a relatively new president. He wants to beat Boko Haram. He's scared of them. Everyone is. He's freaking out about Chad. He's been like, I mean, there's news articles every day where he's like, alarm bells. Like, we don't have the Chadians anymore. We can't beat these guys ourselves. Like, I don't know what to do, but we need Chad to be stable. And then you go up to Niger. This is interesting, too. Niger, of course, is where those American soldiers died along the border with Mali. We have 3 drone bases in Niger. It's one of the places in Africa that we're most active in. And they have generally not had as much internal rebellion from like an Islamist movement until recently. Basically, Mali spilled over. And so their tri-border region, it's very confusing because there's so many of these, where Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger meet, that's the heartland of, ISIS, what they call like, ISIS Sahel or whatever, ISIS West Africa Province, ISWAP. And also much more potent, although we focus on the ISIS threat, is JNIM, which is a conglomeration of 3 or 4 different Islamist and Tuareg groups that is affiliated with Al-Qaeda. The violence in that tri-border region right now is off the rails. And it's where every year breaks the year's record before, and 2021 is on track to beat 2020, which was the record. It's on track to beat it well before the year ends. What's interesting, though, is Chad never really had troops in Niger. It did have troops in Mali, and it still does as part of the MINUSMA, which is the UN mission there, which is the most dangerous UN mission in the world. I think like 86, no, more than that, like over 100 MINUSMA soldiers have died. And they support France's Operation Barkhane, which even though it covers the Sahel, is most active in Mali. But what's interesting is just this year, after the G5 Sahel conference that France oversees for their Barkhane mission, which was held where? In Chad's capital, like everything else, everyone thought Macron might pull troops. There was a lot of speculation. We talked about it last time. He didn't. He said, I'm keeping this like surge level troops that I put here last year in Mali mostly, but also Burkina Faso and Niger. Chad said, look, I'm your indispensable friend. Keep me in power. Well, they didn't do such a good job. Keep me in power, France, and I'll give you 1,200 more troops. Where'd they send them? Most of them right now are in southwest Niger, where it's heating up there for the first time. Niger had generally been spared the worst of it. Not so right now. That's the new theater. Final caveat to that, there are massive allegations in the last few months. They only just got there, the Chadian 1,200 troops. Well, they are raping women, like credible accusations, and maybe murdering people. In other words, Chad's army is useful if you need bodies. It's not useful if you don't want a scandal, because they're going to give you one. Whether it was in Mali, now southwest Niger, and over again in the Central African Republic, if Chadian troops are deployed there, here's another one of my predictions. You show me a new mission for Chadian troops, I'll bet you a $10 scratch off tech. Within 6 months, you're reading a UN report of extrajudicial killings and rape. And so that's fascinating. Now, will Chad keep those 1,200 extra troops in Niger? France hopes so, because they're stretched. But I think what I did there is to show you that any one of those things, if it really blows up, is enough to destabilize Chad and its new regime, and the whole region, of course, which it already is destabilized.
Right. And this just seems like especially the U.S. and France compounding blunder on top of blunder, because from my understanding, particularly in Burkina Faso and Niger, like Islamic radicalism really wasn't a problem until after Libya, when the radicals spilled over and then they got involved in like ethnic disputes, mainly between two ethnic groups. I can't pronounce the names. My understanding is one's more herder and one's more nomadic, but Will, I know we're running short on time here, but Will, if you got a last question or something.
Actually, I'm all out on Chad, but I did have one thing about Mozambique I wanted to mention. If you don't have anything else on Chad, Kyle.
Yeah, go ahead.
Or if you do. Okay, yeah. Last time we were on, I think we last talked in March, and at that time, I think the U.S. had sent like just a dozen or so trainers to Mozambique. They're to train up the local forces. They're fighting some kind of Islamist insurgency. But I wonder if you had seen, well, first of all, just any interesting updates there, but more specifically, about a week or two ago, the French energy company, Total, or I'm not sure how you're supposed to pronounce that, but they announced that they were pulling all their people out of Mozambique, and they're citing the security situation. And I think they even put a big, like $20 billion natural gas pipeline project on hold there. And so I'm wondering, I know I've seen the French talking about they're watching Mozambique. I'm wondering if you had seen that and whether you think that maybe the French will get involved there to protect their investment or whatever.
So yeah, actually that liquid natural gas project is the largest energy project in Africa by amount. It's I think 55 billion. Oh, wow. Total did pull out, because they had pulled out temporarily once before. And Mozambique's government promised, no, we'll crack down, like we'll secure you. We'll keep I think they wanted like a 50-mile radius or something of security around their facilities. Yeah. And of course they just couldn't do it. France is pretty overstretched right now. So they're out for now. They say they're out for good. They have another project going on in Uganda, by the way, which I've been reading. They're worried now that the other like supposed ISIS affiliate, but very local grievance in Congo, is going to threaten that because they have cross-border ties to Uganda, and the leadership of that group, right, is Ugandan. So here's the other thing. I like little quips like this, but I think they can be useful. You show me a conflict in Africa, I'll show you a French involvement, even if one doesn't seem obvious, even if it's not an old French colony. So Total has an enormous amount of investments in Africa. It's kind of almost like a family-run business, at least at the top, if not literally always family, although there's some of that. These people are what they call like French Africans, like rather than African French. They've spent their whole lives like living and working in Africa. French multinational companies like Total, which is the largest but not the only one, they run the airports, the electricity, the water, the transportation projects in most of Francophone Africa, their former colonies. Right. And this is important to understand because it's a big deal to them. And they have a lot of influence, just like our corporations do, on the government in Paris. The reason I say France is involved, so Mozambique is a Portuguese colony. But even though they just send some special forces down there, ridiculous, like we talked about last time, they don't have the ass, the Portuguese, to play in Africa. France has a little more, and they have the will in the way the Portuguese don't. So France is the main investor in that project. But France has actually kind of taken on some of the smaller European colonies, post-colonial, as their own, like Rwanda, which was Belgian, right? Like the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which was Belgian. France has intervened there a few times, like with soldiers to support Sese Seko, who was like Mobutu, like one of the worst dictators ever, like who may have eaten people, like one of those guys. Like that's when an African dictator is not really a good African dictator unless he's at least been somewhat credibly accused of cannibalism. But here's the thing. French troops are in that channel between Madagascar, which was the former French colony. Yeah. Okay. The French have been accused, I'm not sure if it's true or not, that some of it is complicated, of being involved in a coup there in 2009, in Madagascar, that is. Why would they have been involved? Well, the government that got overthrown wanted to renegotiate the terms of the energy and public service contracts with the French companies. But there's islands that are part of France in that channel there. Like Mayotte is the biggest one. And the French do have military bases there, and including some fighter planes, I believe. So the point is, France is watching Mozambique to watch its investments, but they're not just watching, they're there. And they have basically aircraft carrier islands that they can use. And those islands, because France has a weird situation in the way that it's run, they have the same political status as Paris. That's France, just like Algeria used to be. So, they're small, they have small populations, and they're very poor. It's the poorest, like, sub-district of, like, the French government, of, like, the French landmass. But yeah, there's bases there. We should always keep an eye on that area. No one really knows that, but, in other words, Mozambique looks really far from the French colonies. It's not.
Yeah. All right, Danny. Well, fantastic. I know you got to get going. Anything you got to wrap up with? If not, just tell people where they could find all of your work. And then as well as, checking out this episode, Danny has 2 recent articles at antiwar.com on the subject. Our dear friend Deby is dead. Yeah, about that. And then the more recent article is Deby's Death, Chad's Crisis, and the Ghost of Libyan Fiasco's Past. I really love that title. So, Danny, what else do you got to plug, or anything else you got?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna be, I'm gonna do some stuff that's not Africa coming up. But when I come back to Africa sooner than later, until someone else dies or another revolution starts, then I'll have to write about it. I'm gonna be shifting into that, looking at that Southwest Niger thing, as well as Burkina Faso. I think we need to keep an eye on that. And I think we need to keep asking the question, is Macron going to get his Biden bailout? And then the last thing is, you're probably going to see some work from me on what's going on with the French 20 generals and up to maybe 10 or 20,000 former soldiers who signed this open letter calling for a coup, threatening a coup, saying that there's going to be a civil war if Macron doesn't crack down on Islamists and what they called immigrant hordes. That's a big story, and it's going to ripple into Africa. Most of those retired generals have ties and served in Africa, and they're really bullish on Africa. They believe that what makes France a great power is having those African colonies. So, keep an eye on that and expect more from me. As for where to find me, usually Thursday, sometimes more, anywar.com. Check out skepticalvet.com for anything I do, including speaking appearances like this, and on Twitter at skepticalvet. And then also, last thing, Eisenhower Media Network.org. That's the organization that I'm the director of, which is, people vaguely like me, anti-war vets from the rank of, sergeant to to 2-star general, who, we publish their articles, we get them placed, and we get them in speaking appearances in media. And we're hammering a lot of these issues home as a group. So, hey, thanks again for that opportunity.
All right, Danny, thank you so much for coming back on. We'll have to do it again soon.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
I'll see you next time something terrible happens.
All right.